Israel Update with Gadi Tau and Mike Duran. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Israel Update. And my guest today is Mlani פיליפס. Hi, Mlani.
Hi, Gadi.
The British journalist. I was once very afraid of Mlani. I used to read her fiery op-eds when I was on the left, and I thought she's smart. So that's dangerous. Well, now from the other side, we're cheering her new book, and it's called The Builder's Stone. I want to show you, if possible, what it looks like, because it's already out on Amazon. The Builder's Stone: How Jews and Christians Build the West, and Why Only They Can Save It. So congratulations, Mlani, for the recently published book.
Thank you.
You begin with October 7th. You say that October 7th turbocharged the West's decades-long process of cultural suicide. How so?
Well, this book had rather a long gestation. I first had the idea for it some years ago, long before October 7. I had written, as you may or may not know, for many years about the way in which the West was, in my view, committing cultural suicide. The ruling class, the ruling intelligentsia, the elites were taking a wrecking ball to the institutions of the West, family, education system, and to its values. I'd written about this for a long time, and I thought about it in a different way. I began to think about it in a different way, and I thought to myself in this way, that what was in the sights of the West, what was their target, was, as I've said, the core values of the West. The core values, it is generally assumed, come from Christianity, and that is in itself true. Christianity was the foundational creed of the West. But what people never thought about, never think about, is that Christianity itself didn't sort of arise from nothing. It's based on Judaism and the values, the core values that the West holds most dear: respect for human life, respect for in every person's life, the importance of compassion, the importance of justice, rule of law based on the consent of the people. These things and many more actually came from Judaism. And I was thinking about this, thinking, well, here's the thing. The West is committing suicide. How could it stop itself from going off the edge of the cultural cliff? Well, it would have to do the following things. It would have to reconnect itself to those Jewish values. And the fact that those Jewish values are in its sights perhaps explains the fact, and this is long before October 7, explains the fact that the Western liberal elites are so hostile to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism was at record levels long before October 7. So I was having this thought to myself and thinking, well, in addition, can the Jewish people give some guidance to the West to stop itself from going off the edge of the cultural cliff? Because what the Jewish people have done, which is its kind of calling card, is cultural survival. Are there lessons that could be learned from the Jewish people? And I was thinking about that and thinking what the lessons were. And that was where I got to on October the 6th, 2023. And then I saw what happened, not just on October 7th, but what happened afterwards, which was deeply shattering for people who have close connections, as I do, with Britain, which was that whereas one might have thought that the West would have understood what was at stake for Israel and supported it in its defense against genocide, attempted genocide. Instead, the West turned on Israel, represented falsely its attempts to defend itself as aggression, and represented its aggressors as semi-defenseless people. And
were you surprised?
I wasn't. I was surprised by the ferocity and the obsessional nature of it, and the fact that there was so little public pushback, and the fact that over many months, this madness, it was a complete madness, it is a complete madness, infected not just the people on the streets with these dreadful demonstrations calling for the murder of Jews, Intifada now, and so on and so forth, but has infected in Britain anyway, virtually the entire top tier of the culture. And it suddenly occurred to me that, in fact, it was the same story, that what we had seen on October 7 was a kind of gauntlet that had been laid down to the West. The question, do you support, at this point, do you support civilization or barbarism? And we had the answer. They did not support civilization. And you had to ask yourself why this was, and how could you possibly explain the kind of deranged nature of the complete repudiation of reason and evidence, let alone decency and conscience. And in my view, the explanation was what I'd been working on for several years, which was that the West had basically destroyed its own moral compass over many years, its own moral and intellectual compass. It had repudiated reason, it had repudiated conscience, and it repudiated what it itself was. It had told itself for many years that the West was fundamentally rotten, born in the original sins of, colonialism and imperialism and racism and all the rest of it. And it had to be basically destroyed and replaced by a brave new world with the brotherhood of man, John Lennon's Imagine Kumbaya. And I thought, this is it. This is we're seeing playing out in real time. The crisis is now upon it because it doesn't even know what civilization is. It's told itself that Western civilization, which, embodied civilized values, it's told itself that Western civilization was actually rotten. So it doesn't even understand what civilization is. So how can it possibly have understood that when Israel was attacked, it wasn't just Israel being attacked, but civilization being attacked and the West being attacked? So all these things came together.
Yeah, a strong clue, I think, to your argument is if you look at the new, we now call them woke, I guess, but the forces that we all know, the post-colonial studies, the radical gender studies, the multiculturalists and the detractors of religion and nationalism, all these target the Jews first. And so if one looks at your argument in an inverted way, would it be a reasonable rendering to say you're looking at these people who are wrecking Western civilization, and then asking, why do they attack the Jews first? And then when you invert it, you say, well, maybe what the Jews hold is also, they know why the Jews are their enemies.
Well, exactly. And when you look at the ideologies with which they have, with which the liberal West, the intelligentsia in the West has replaced religion, basically, secular ideologies, all the isms, multiculturalism, moral relativism, deep environmentalism, a whole range of isms. When you boil them down, it's quite extraordinary. Every single one of them is fundamentally gunning for either Judaism, its Jewish religious precepts, or the Jewish people, or the state of Israel, every single one of them. And, it's therefore hardly a surprise. Once you've kind of twigged that, once you've kind of realized that, it's hardly a surprise that, lo and behold, they're gunning overtly now for us.
Yeah, I was very happy to read this argument. I have to confess, I'm a biased reader here, because my thoughts around the same topics were in the aftermath of Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the joint session of both houses of Congress. Because, I teach at a university, and you know what's going on in academia. So if you look at what's happened to the study of Zionism, you'd see that it's all Edward Said. It's all Zionism is the last vestige of European colonialism. It is a reactionary rearguard action of evil that has to be swept out of the Middle East. And then comes Benjamin Netanyahu and says, no, this is the front line in the war of civilization against barbarism. He actually used the very same terms that you do. He alluded to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and he said it's not a clash of civilizations, it's a clash of civilization and barbarism. So we have a war of narratives or a struggle between two frameworks about what Zionism is. And the question is this really about Jews, or are Jews here the proxy for the war between the classic liberalism and Western values and the woke?
It's on different levels, but I think fundamentally it is a war against Jews or Jewish precepts, because there is a war I would say by liberalism, except that, I'm British by origin, and to me, liberalism is something different from the way in which liberalism is interpreted in America. In America, liberalism tends to be elided with leftism, and where I'm coming from, it's traditional liberalism as was invented by the British Enlightenment thinkers, and that liberalism was really a creed that kind of invented tolerance, particularly religious tolerance. And what it said was, a society, a nation, a culture, is based on these precepts, which at the time were biblical precepts. But we allow minorities to practice their own cultures, their own religions, and so on. We don't try and obliterate them. We welcome them. We allow it, but they have to sign up to our overarching bedrock values. That was to me what liberalism was. And when I was younger, when I was considered to be a signed up leftist, I didn't really understand the difference between liberalism and leftism. And what happened to me, I don't know whether it was the same thing that happened to you, was that I came to realize that my assumptions had been wrong, that there was actually a great difference between liberalism and leftism. And that what I assumed were liberals marching alongside me in pursuit of the same goals of justice, the deliverance of the oppressed, standing up against abuses of power, upholding truth, and all those sorts of things. I thought that the people alongside me were liberals like me. And then I realized that they were not. They were on the other side. They were upholding the opposite of what I believed. And I realized they weren't liberals at all. They were leftists. They were marching to a drum which was basically Marxist. Not that they were necessarily Marxists in themselves. They probably never read Marx. They would have been, they would have laughed at the idea they were Marxists. But I could hear that the kind of discourse that they were using, which is the discourse basically of what we call now the woke, divided everything, divided every type of human relationship into the powerful and the powerless. It was all power structures, and it was a kind of zero-sum game. Either you were powerful or you were powerless. If you were powerful, you could do no good. If you were powerless, you could do no bad. The Western world, in this conception, was entirely powerful because it had dominated the world. It was capitalism and all the rest of it, and it was white people who'd done this. So white people in the West were powerful and could therefore do no right, whereas the people in the developing world, people with brown and black skins, were necessarily the victims of Western imperialism, racism, and all the rest of it. And because they were victims and because they were powerless, they could do no wrong. And here we are today, with the Palestinian Arabs deemed to be never doing anything wrong. And insofar as they do wrong, in that they, let's take the example of October 7, commit Nazi-style abuses and atrocities of extraordinary bestiality and savagery and barbarism, it must be Israel's fault because Israel is deemed to be powerful. Why? Because Israel...
That this barbarism, the beheading of babies can somehow be transformed into, as Judith Butler calls it, armed resistance.
Yes.
But let me protest the term, the comparison with the Nazis, Melanie, because there was a Hebrew poet who said the Arabs are not like the Nazis. Their murder is wet with blood. And it's true. There's something about the Nazi Holocaust is distant. It's industrial. It's almost antiseptic. The horror is, and when you look at
scientific
on October 7th, and you look at what they say, eating the livers of your enemies, and the hands-on. Wallowing in blood and fire, then these are. I'm not saying I don't want to compare the level of horror, but it's a horror of a different kind, and it's very vivid. And if you live in Israel, and you think people need to live to share a border with these barbarians. These sadistic, bloodthirsty barbarians, then you think back at how did we ever imagine that anything of the kind of a two-state solution was viable? I should be asking myself because I don't think you believed in it, but I did.
Well, I didn't know whether I believed in it or not. I thought it was unrealistic, but it took me a long time to understand, first of all, the history, which made the whole thing of a two-state solution ridiculous. Because if you understand anything of the history of pre-Israel Palestine under the British mandate, you can see that the two-state solution was invented by the British in the 1930s when the British took their internationally legally binding duty to settle the Jewish people throughout what is now the State of Israel, the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank as it's called, and Gaza, on the basis that only the Jews had any historical and legal right to that land, because it was only the Jewish people as a people who had ever had it as their national kingdom. The British took that duty under international law and shredded it and said, in the face of the murderous pogroms and rampages being committed against the Jews of pre-Israel Palestine by the Palestinian Arabs, the British said to the Arabs, well, you have part of it. We'll divide the land between you. And of course, the Arabs said no, and they went to war to obliterate any kind of Jewish homeland. Now, that situation has not changed for the last 100 years. The West, now not just Britain, but Europe and America, continue to offer to people pursuing a jihadi religiously based annihilation program against the Jewish people and against the State of Israel. They continue to offer them what the Jews alone are entitled to, and they continue to lie about that entitlement. They continue to pretend that there is no such entitlement. And it's that fundamental lie which is behind the two-state solution, which cannot therefore be a solution. You cannot have a solution to a lie. The solution to the lie is the truth. You cannot take the lie and say, on the basis of this lie, we're going to proceed to divide up the land or do anything, because then it becomes a lie upon a lie, and the result is more murder and mayhem. That's what's happened.
But I can tell you where it originated and why it was so seductive. First of all, there was great denial. Now, in the aftermath of October 7th, suddenly testimonies surfaced from the pogrom in Hebron in 1929, and it was exactly the same. I mean, exactly the same in the horror. There was less technology, but they burned, mutilated, killed, dismembered children in front of their parents. The whole thing, and we somehow compartmentalized that, and then came the two-state solution. Now, I don't know about the question of lies and truth necessarily here, but from the perspective of Zionism, I think the basic misunderstanding, which relates directly to your observation about barbarism, is that we imagine the barbarians in our own image. I think that's at the heart of multiculturalism too. You just assume that people with no values are exactly like you. So if you're a relativist and drop your own values, we will all drop our values and just be all human rights bearing individuals, and that's just an illusion. But Zionism imagined the Palestinian national movement in its own image, and the Zionist creed is built on a universal value. The sentence which divides our Declaration of Independence into two, between the account of the past and the plan for the future, is the core of the document. And it says it is the natural right of the Jewish people to be like all peoples, masters of their own fate in their own sovereign state. And that, Mlani, is very seductive to intellectuals, because you say this is a universal right. We can't deny that right to others. If we divide the land, then it's a coherent, symmetric argument, which on top of all this takes care of your national interest as well as of your universal values. So it reconciles egotism and altruism. It's completely symmetric and whole. One problem doesn't work.
No, but this fixed belief in this idea that that you see the world through the prism of your own culture is absolutely the Western default position, and it explains a very great deal. It is so fundamentally ingrained that you see it through your own Western prism. You basically believe that every single people or group in the world is governed by the things that govern you. So they're governed by reason and rationality, and they're governed by self-interest. And this is what lies behind the implacable determination to impose a two-state solution. Because for every single conflict in the world, there has to be a negotiated settlement, a negotiated resolution. I mean, as I understand it, in departments of war studies, as they once were called, and I think sometimes still are called, conflict resolution is what they're taught. The idea that you go to war and that therefore one side has to either surrender or be defeated and the other side wins unequivocally is considered barbaric. It's considered as a kind of throwback, because it means that people might die, and there is nothing, in the words of John Lennon, there is nothing to fight or die for, because we don't have a culture or a nation that we believe is legitimate, because we believe in the brotherhood of man. So there is nothing to fight or die for. So we cannot have war because we cannot have death. So what do you have? You have conflict resolution, you have negotiation, you have peace processes, you have compromise on the basis that every single person in the world, including the Ayatollahs in Iran, including the Hamasniks, including Mahmoud Abbas, including Vladimir Putin, everybody is governed by two things, reason and self-interest. So the Western mind cannot get its head around religious motivation. Faced with a civilization, a society, a culture, the Islamic world, which in its most pure religious form, its most conservative, pure religious form, says to itself, the world is divided into two. There is the Islamic world, which is the world of God, the world of truth, the world of righteousness, and there is the non-Islamic world, which is the world of the devil. And it is our duty to God to make sure that that non-Islamic world becomes Islamic. And so every single human bomb, every single act of terror is sanctified, literally sanctified in their minds. Now, if you transfer to Britain, where there have been some dreadful Islamic atrocities, killing a lot of people and injuring a lot more, people are horrified, they're appalled. It's so inhuman, it's so beyond their comprehension that people go in to a public place and strap themselves with this weapon, turn themselves into a weapon. It's very hard to get your head around that. And so because they're Western, they explain it as the product of despair. And to me, and I'm sure to you, and to people living in Israel, we can see it's not despair at all. It is exaltation. Okay, some of them are pathetic people. They've got mental illness. They are possibly terrified. That's all true. But it's basically exaltation. Allahu Akbar means something. God is great. They are ecstatic. This is what they're born and bred for. You look at the Palestinian Authority. Forget the Hamas for a minute. The Palestinian Authority teaches its children from the cradle, your highest, most sacred duty is to kill, because it's the work of God. Now, the Western mind, the British mind, the American mind, it cannot understand this. It thinks religion is ridiculous. It simply cannot get its head around it. And in my experience, which is limited, the people who really do get it, who are not part of the Muslim world, tend to be, believing Christians, because they understand what religion does. They understand the overwhelming strength of religious motivation, both for good and ill. So we're in a situation where the secular West not only has abandoned its core beliefs about itself, which keep itself going and which have informed and created its own once great culture, but it is institutionally incapable of understanding the world that it then proceeds to interfere with disastrous consequences, as we've seen.
One listening to your argument may misconstrue it as saying, well, there's religious fanaticism and it's very dangerous, which is true. So the cure would be secular liberalism. And yet your argument goes the other way. You're saying the problem with the West is that it forgot the fact that religion is the foundation of culture. Where do you personally stand in that? Do you consider yourself religious?
That's a very big question.
It is a big question. We have time, Mlani.
I'm certainly much more observant than I used to be. And to that extent, I am a religious Jewish woman, by which I mean that is quite different from what I would say if I was a religious Christian, because I think the whole idea of religion and faith are understood quite differently in the Jewish world and in the non-Jewish world. In the non-Jewish world, i.e. the Christian world, that's what I'm talking about, faith is considered something that, faith and religion are considered things, they're considered something that is a kind of private communion between the individual and the Almighty. You commune with the Almighty, possibly through a priest, but you commune with the Almighty. You do it it's a private discussion. You do it in a church alongside other people, but it's between you and the Almighty. And that's faith. And if you don't believe in the Almighty, you haven't got any religion. It just doesn't, why would you go to church if you don't believe in it? Because Christianity puts all its eggs in the supernatural basket. If you don't believe in the story of, Jesus walking from the tomb in which he had been buried after he was crucified, then there's nothing there. So the whole thing is negated. And I think that's part of Christianity's problem, as I've tried to explain in the book. Whereas Judaism is quite different. Judaism, it's based on faith in that sense. You believe, it's based on a very, very strong belief in God. But nobody makes a big deal about belief in God. It's just sort of accepted that that's what it is. And then the religion itself, the observances of the religion, which are many and copious, are devoted to how you actually live a better life, how you make a better person for yourself, how you live in a better way, to do good rather than bad, to look after others, and a whole range of things like that. And all the religious observances are knitted into the most banal and everyday of activities, including, bathroom and bedroom habits. And it's a spectrum, and some people observe a very great deal of that, and some people observe less, and some people observe nothing. But that is what the religion is. So
I can testify that the restaurant you chose for us to have dinner in Jerusalem was a kosher one. But I'll tell you, because
I'm glad you made that clear. I was getting a bit concerned about this.
I'll tell you about my predicament with this, because I believe in the important role of religion, but I'm not a believer. And so I come at it from an angle, I'd say a Geertzian angle, as in Clifford Geertz. And because my intellectual journey, that was a very early stage when I read the interpretation of cultures, and religion is a cultural system. And what religion does, said Clifford Geertz, is I'll paraphrase it in my way, is it prevents the chaotic in life from sabotaging or from collapsing your sense of meaning. So it has this ability to absorb what you cannot understand without jeopardizing your sense that life is still meaningful. And in that respect, that's how I understand your argument.
Yeah, but that's true.
I understand your argument as that there is a system of meaning that is underpinned in religion. And the question is not if we are all going to church or not. The question is, are we able to cling to our system of meaning and the values embedded in it in the face of challenges and disappointments? And I think, when we try to understand when did the West become postmodern, because that's what we're talking about basically, the relativism of the postmodernists, there is no truth, there's only a personal truth, all that. then you look at the real shocks that Western culture had to absorb, and these are World War I and World War II in the modern sense. After that, you see all the art that says that life is meaningless and all that, and the Holocaust, of course, in it. So the Jews are on again. So religion in your interpretation of what the cure is, what role does religion in general and the Jewish religion in particular, what would it play in your plan to stem the decline of Western civilization?
Yeah, I mean, I say in the book, I'm not trying to convert people to any kind of religious practice. But what's been lost, and I think to such disastrous effect in the West, is the idea that the things that we hold so dear in the West are nothing to do with biblical religion. And we can sort of make them up as we go along, and we can replace them, and that has led the West into a ruinous trajectory in which the West is basically losing the plot completely. And so we have to get back. We collectively have to get back to that biblical settlement. Now, does that mean people need to be more religious? Well, not necessarily. You can have people, and I can think of many people like this, and it's not so far different from me myself, from me myself. But as you were just saying, one may not have a religious sense or a belief in God oneself, but one can see the disaster of a society which has repudiated the biblical values. So, one wants to go back to that for that reason alone. Now, it's very hard to do that if you can't even talk about religion. So one of the things I say in the book is that religion needs a PR makeover. It is socially embarrassing, certainly in Britain, and elsewhere in the West, to say that you're a religious person. You're regarded immediately by the liberal intelligentsia as basically thick, as basically stupid, as basically dense, dim, uneducated, a troglodyte. And there is this idea that, in the box marked reason and progress and all good things is secularism. And in the other box, but marked religion, is backwardness, obscurantism, superstition, and cretinous stupidity. Now, simply that's not true. As I say in the book, you wouldn't have had science without the revolutionary Jewish ideas contained in the Hebrew Bible. And there have been, over the centuries, many, many scientists who have been religious believers. And indeed, the whole sort of Enlightenment scientific revolution came from people originally who were religious people. So there's no problem about that. And when you look at some of the smartest people today, they are religious believers. And lastly, the thing that really sort of set me back. It amazed me when I first realized this, was that this idea that if you're an atheist, you're smart, and if you're a religious believer, you are completely stupid. I mean, some of the atheistic attempts, some of the attempts by atheists to square various circles because of their atheistic beliefs are very comical and really, really stupid. I'll give you one example which knocked me for six when I first came across it. There was a book that I read which described in lovingly great detail the precise specifications of the spaceship which would have carried the original seeds of human life on Earth, of life on Earth, life force, life forms. And it came in a spaceship. And this author described in great detail the precise ramifications of the spaceship. And he says, it's a short book, and he says, in the course of writing this book, he says, my wife has looked over my shoulder and seen what I was writing. He was a scientist, seen what I was writing, and said to me, this reads more like science fiction than science. And he says in the book, and so I said to my wife, you're right, it does sound like science fiction, but it's less unbelievable than the alternative. The alternative being belief in God. Who was the author of this book? It was none other than Sir Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of DNA, one of the most distinguished scientists of the modern age. Now, how does one explain this lunacy? It's simply this, that a certain type of secular individual has made materialism into the religion. So everything in the world, the universe and beyond has to be explained, can only be explained by things that are. We know that there are other planets. We know that for a fact. Fine. We know that there is therefore a possibility of life on other planets. Okay, so far we can agree. And therefore, by materialistic logic, it could be that the life form on the other planets somehow got itself to Earth. And that is a perfectly reasonable explanation for how life on Earth started, because it's based on materialism, as opposed to God, which is based on nothing except belief. Now, this is barking mad. And I've heard this expounded by other scientists. And so once you realize this, and there are many other examples of where very distinguished secular individuals and scientists have tied themselves up in ludicrous knots, trying to square the circle. That, for example, science tells us, they tell us, nothing can come of nothing. Okay? I've been, brought up to believe that. I understand nothing can come of nothing. And yet they say that existence, life, spontaneously erupted from nothing. How can the two be true? And they tie themselves up in knots, and it is ludicrous. So in my view, and one of the things I say in the book, is that wouldn't it be wonderful if in the coalition of the civilized, as I would call it, the countercultural resistance that I'm calling for, composed of people of all creeds and cultures, the divisions that we all know between left and right and white and black and men and women and gay people and straight people, useless, nonsense. These aren't the divisions. The divisions are within those groups between the people who want the West to continue and the people who want the West to be destroyed. Fine. So I'm calling for a coalition of the people who want the West to continue. Wouldn't it be wonderful if among the many, many tasks that I have set out that they must attend to in order to save civilization, wouldn't it be wonderful if they were able to mount a PR offensive showing how stupid atheism is in certain respects, showing how clever, how smart some of the most distinguished people are in the West, and showing how religion, and specifically Judaism, contributed a huge amount to the development of reason and rationality, which most people in the West consider sprang fully formed from the secular mind, or possibly just came from the Greeks. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that narrative was changed? And I think, to cut a very, very long story somewhat shorter, that not only would it kind of change the kind of the basis of the debate that we should have and don't have, but I also think this, and I've said this in the book, that when God was pronounced dead by the secular liberals, it was done on the basis, among other things, that religion was really, really horrible. It was the cause of misery. It constrains you. It prevents you from fulfilling yourself. It prevents you from the freedom to live as you want. And so you get rid of religion and then you're happy. Okay, so where are we now? We have absolutely record amounts of basically mental and psychological distress, particularly among young people. And when you boil it down, a great deal of that is a spiritual hunger. There is no meaning to their lives. And I think that especially among young people, but also among others, there is such a hunger for a meaning to life. And, the idea that you get rid of religion and all that goes away and you just got to get on with your life and you're all happy. I mean, look at what's happening. One of the fastest growing things in the West is witchcraft. I mean, how is that evidence of a rational society? It's all part of this idea of this impulse that people have. It's like hardwired, I think, into humanity. We search for a meaning to life, and if we told ourselves, as we have, well, you're not going to find it in biblical religion because that's just bunk. Well, then you go elsewhere. You end up, being an ordained wizard or whatever it is. And so anyway, so I think there is a great potential actually for an intelligent, smart approach to religion, which I think would change the entire debate and the entire atmosphere for the better.
Can you say a few words about what concretely you mean by returning to the foundations that are in the Bible? Do you mean the actual because the Bible is both a narrative of history and a list of rules, right? It's both. It's so are these the rules? Is this the meaning of the story? What when you are talking about returning to the Bible?
I'm not talking about enacting for everybody, the arcana of Jewish religious practices. I'm talking about what they embody, the principles that they embody. So there are many and various principles that they embody, obviously. But one central thing I would suggest is moral responsibility, individual personal responsibility. Now, what the modern secular world has done is basically they abolished the idea of truth, and they abolished the idea of distinctions. They imposed the idea of equality of values. So you can't distinguish between one value and another. You can't say one set of values is superior to any other. And the whole notion of moral agency went out the window, because what mattered was the consequences of actions. It doesn't matter. Don't tell me, they say, that Israel is defending itself against genocidal attack. All that matters is dead Palestinian Arab children, which we can see on our TV. Moral agency doesn't matter. It's all to do with consequences. And as a result, you're not held responsible for your own actions. So if you are, so this has developed into a culture of rights. You don't have duties, you have rights. Rights mean demands that you feel entitled to make of others, of the state. And your demands as a group must win over the demands of another group. How do they win? Well, through power, through exercise of power. Anyway, this whole set of consequences, as it were, of a society which has basically destroyed the idea of moral distinctions, of a hierarchy of values, of moral responsibility, has led us to hell in a handcart. Now, moral responsibility is what the Hebrew Bible gave the world. You take responsibility for your own actions. And we have to get back to that. So we have to get away from a society based on rights to a society based on duties, for which we have to start by abolishing the whole infrastructure, what we are told are human rights, which are not human rights at all. The idea of human rights, free floating from any duties, is ludicrous. I mean, who is supposed to give you these rights? It's philosophically incoherent. And because it's philosophically incoherent and legally incoherent, because, a body of law that's not anchored in a national jurisdiction has no, in my view, legitimacy, because it's not anchored in popular consent and is therefore obviously going to become a tool of political forces. And that's what we see in the international tribunals, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. These are basically political bodies masquerading as legal or judicial bodies. And so, we have to start by undoing what's been done, and to return to the idea that we should be bound by duties to others. Now, who is to proclaim that that set of values? Well, it has to be people who actually are religious leaders. Unfortunately, I'm speaking again from the perspective of Britain. It's different in America, I'm sure. Britain is a particularly godless society, and the church has led the godlessness. I mean, unfortunately, that's another story. But basically, you need religious leaders to show people that the path of duty and responsibility is not just productive for others, but actually productive for you, because you will feel better if you're given challenges to yourself, which you have to overcome. It produces, it's part of the business of producing life's meaning. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about, and also other stuff which is much more controversial and much more contentious, and therefore even more difficult to push through. But for example, the idea of the the kind of sacredness, as it were, of sexuality, because what sexuality is in the world of the Hebrew Bible is the production of children, which is a sacred task because it continues the human race, it continues the Jewish people. Now, that sacralization of sexuality, I mean, certainly in Britain, which is utterly debauched and degraded, I think probably more than other Western societies, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert on everything else, on everywhere else. But in Britain, it is pretty out there. It's pretty fundamentally awful. You have children regarded as highly sexualized beings, and it is your responsibility as the adult world to equip them with the means to really get the most out of sexual relationships of one kind or another. And if they are underage, well, you just go with it because, the important thing is to stop them having babies. It's that. And this is not even talked about. Anyone who would talk about it would be regarded as completely off the wall. But it has had the most appalling effects in brutalizing a whole range of people, not least the girls themselves who become victims, but certainly the boys. Absolutely brutalize the boys. And now, pornography is how they learn sexual behavior. Because what was once considered pornography and completely beyond the pale is now on British TVs and in cinemas the whole time. And so it's called the Overton window has shifted. And so now what's considered pornography is bestiality, it is sadism, it is sadomasochism. And this is what young people, children in Britain are being taught. Now, you can't begin to unravel that unless you get back to sexual order, which basically was invented by the Jews.
What I used to like about British society, I don't know if that's still there, is actually that it had a place even for sexual deviancy, except for things that actually harm people, without legitimizing it in the public sphere. So it had a respect for privacy, because I lean closer to libertarianism, but I don't think that libertarianism means that you will have drag queens explaining sex to 7-year-olds. So I think what happened probably with American Protestantism is that it can't suffer that there is something in private that should remain private and that is no one's business.
Correct.
And so it had to drag everything to the public sphere. And that's my objection, because if Americans don't have an Edmund Burke, and they hardly have a conception of, I don't know who was the first to put it in this succinct and brilliant way, is that hypocrisy is the tribute.
The tribute that vice pays to virtue.
Vice pays to virtue, exactly. So the because, I heard one prominent conservative speak about biblical morality in some conference, and there were two gays in the panel. One of them, a very prominent defender of Israel, Douglas Murray. And when, and when he sat there and says, return to biblical rules and morality, one of them reminded them, well, there are two people on this stage for whom that would be the idea that you should that being gay is deviancy would be horrifying. So returning to the Bible is obviously, as you say, you don't mean returning to stoning women who, how do you say in English, who betray their husbands? I don't remember the term in the English commandments, in the English translation of the commandments, but in Hebrew it's lotin af. Do not betray your spouse, I guess, would be a reasonable translation. But the concern, I think, should be with the stability of the moral compass rather than the act. Because listening to you, I ask myself, do you actually mean only that, or would you return to a sort of Puritan morality that would invade the private sphere in order to police it?
Certainly not. I mean, I think, as you've been saying, one of the key things that's gone wrong is the destruction of the notion of privacy, and that's directly resulting from what's called identity politics. When politics itself became kind of people got fed up with that, and we went wrong, and it didn't work, and so people instead became culture warriors, and your identity became your political badge, identity in terms of race and in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality. And so the idea of privacy was completely lost, because you had to be able to proclaim, not just proclaim what you were, but to insist that the entire definition of what was normal would be abolished. There could be no normal.
In order to accommodate you.
In order to accommodate you. So the whole thing turned inside out. And I've always tried to draw a line, which is difficult to draw a line, but I've tried to draw it between the individual and the thing. So, to me, if you're talking to people or looking at people in a personal way, you have great sympathy for what they're doing. I have no objection to, two men living together happily, and that's absolutely fine. And I wouldn't dream of questioning that any more than I would dream of saying to someone who turned out to be a sadomasochist at home, or to be into bondage with his wife, I wouldn't say that's appalling, and you must be taken out and basically publicly shamed. It's nothing to do with me. It should be nothing to do with me. The problem is when the nothing to do with me becomes everybody has to basically accept that this is normal and this is to be regulated, not regulated. This is to be recognized as equivalent to everything else, and consequently, if you say everything is equivalent to everything else, then you have no norms to uphold. You have no norms to uphold. Then you have what we have, to me, the whole sort of the whole breakdown of family stuff was absolutely driven, certainly in Britain, by heterosexuals, particularly feminists, who decided that through a combination of the contraceptive pill, so advances in medical science and consumerism, greater wealth, and so on, that all helped form this conclusion that we can now have children without men. Men are basically a waste of space, and so we will choose.
Women need men like fish.
A fish needs a bicycle.
Said Gloria Steinem.
So. And so the idea of marriage is so oppressive because it means that we are shackled to these men. And it's only a piece of paper, as John Lennon famously said. Really, they have a lot to answer for, Beatles. But anyway.
The Beatles.
Or John Lennon in particular. And so it doesn't matter, therefore, if we just live together. I mean, what's wrong with that? It's the same as marriage anyway.
I think we can exonerate George Harrison, though.
Okay, fine. We choose. Lord, yeah. Fine. We choose, this guy and I choose to live together. And what's wrong with that? And you're not supposed to tell me that it's anything wrong with that because, who are you? You're just a sort of troglodyte throwback. And so we're going to have children because, we relate to each other. We love each other. We're a partnership. Now, if I'm faced with a cohabiting heterosexual couple, I don't have a view. I mean, that's, it's nothing to do with me, how they live their lives. But when you have a society that says there is nothing wrong with cohabitation, and we're going to invest it with the same kind of absence of social stigma and the same legal rights and privileges as marriage, because there's no difference, and we have to treat everybody equally, then you have the disaster that's happened in Britain, in which you have galloping cohabitation, which has directly produced mass fatherlessness, in which children are brought up without a father, and in many cases without even knowing who their father is. And if you have a fatherless child, then all the evidence shows that that child is infinitely more likely to fall victim to a vast range of social and personal ills. That cannot be sensible. In other words, in order to advance the idea that everyone's free to live exactly as they like, we, collectively in the West, have done untold harm, not just to the social fabric and the sort of moral sense, but to individual children who grew up to be highly dysfunctional adults who produced children who were highly dysfunctional. That cannot be right. So I've always said to my gay friends, to my cohabiting friends, I have no problem with what you're doing. You know, people who are divorced used to say to me, you are making a judgment about my life and my desire to live as I wanted to live, and to get rid of my husband, and you're telling me that I'm wrong. I didn't even know they were divorced. It's that. But I say to all these people, I've said to all these people in the years when they would talk to me, another story, I've said to all of them, you are sawing off the branch on which you are sitting. You think you can live like this, and there are going to be no consequences for you, your children, your grandchildren, in terms of the life that they are leading being a disaster for them. You're sawing off the branch on which you're sitting. You are eroding the kind of life and values that you hold dearest. And if they are wise and thoughtful, whatever life they're leading, some of them have agreed with me on this. And you mentioned some people. I won't mention names, but there are people in public life, who live irregular lives and who actually fight for precisely what I am saying, precisely because they understand that the West is going down because the West no longer has any benchmarks, because the West has told itself it is cruel to individuals to have these benchmarks. Well, we are where we are.
Mlani, in conclusion, I have two short questions which I can't let you go without having you answer. One is about anti-Semitism in Britain and what's the situation there on the ground. And the other is the name of the book, The Builder's Stone. Why don't we start with the meaning of the name?
The Builder's Stone is drawn from the line in, one of the Psalms, which says, I haven't got the quote in front of me, but it's basically the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And to me, that sort of encapsulates what I'm trying to say about Judaism and the Jewish people and the state of Israel, that they are all variously despised, demeaned, ignored, dismissed.
Or attacked.
Or attacked, yes. And actually, they are the foundation stone of what is considered most valuable, and they are the potential rescue remedy for what's gone wrong. What the West needs to do is to reconfigure entirely how it sees Judaism, the Jewish people in the state of Israel, far from being a nuisance or worse. It should see the Jewish people as an essential resource for the Western society's own resilience and ability to survive. That's why I called it the Builder's Stone.
Mlani, you shuttle between Jerusalem and England and London. So you know what's going on the ground in London. What's the situation there for Jews currently?
Well, it's pretty bad, and yet you can live there as a Jew perfectly happily and not see any problem. And this sounds rather odd, but it's always the case, I think. It's just like living in Israel. People outside Israel say, are you all right? What's happening? Are you, how are you managing? And you're perfectly okay. So there's an element of that. It's always worse when you're looking at it from the outside. However, it is pretty bad. Not so much because of physical violence, because compared to, say, France, it's not really in the same league for various reasons. But there is a great deal of menace and intimidation now, particularly on the streets still every week. These enormous demonstrations, which are supposedly pro-Palestinian, but actually are anti-Israel and anti-Jew. And they are permitted by the police for a variety of reasons. And it means that Jewish people feel too intimidated to go into central London where these demonstrations are taking place.
While they're taking place, or generally don't feel safe to go to central London?
While they're taking place.
So you're not afraid to go on the streets most places?
No, look, No, I mean, I live when I'm in London, I live in central London, and I go around and about, and there isn't a problem. I go on the tube, there isn't a problem, but there are problems from time to time, and in a way that there didn't used to be. In that, you have incidents where an entire carriage of an underground train will start bursting into a refrain of Free Palestine, and if you're a Jew in that carriage, you really don't want to be there. And that's the sort of thing that never happened.
Go with the Jewish signs conspicuously, Stars of David.
Most people hide. Most people hide them, but I have often seen people wearing usually black kippot, which it's a sign of somebody who is particularly observant, and they travel the tube quite openly. But there are lots and lots of little anecdotal evidences of the kind of low level intimidation and feeling of threat. I mean, personally, I go to some lengths not to talk about Israel at all, and more tellingly, and I've heard this from many people, during this whole nightmare that unfolded after October 7, and particularly around October 7 and the immediate aftermath, there was a conspicuous silence from people's non-Jewish colleagues and even their friends. They didn't say, "How are you?" They didn't say, "How are things?" And you knew from the silence what they thought. And it's now the case, you have trade unions, you have professional associations of doctors, you have civil servants in their collective endeavors, you have certainly the cultural establishment. It's very, very difficult, almost impossible for Jewish writers about Jewish subjects to get published. That's, I think, also the case in America. The whole artistic world, the theater world. The default position now is that everyone knows that Israel behaves atrociously. Everyone knows that. And everyone knows the Palestinians, all they want is a state of their own, and then everything will be fine. And everyone knows that the Israelis are killing children. I get regularly, people writing to me, and they very rarely say it to my face, but they write to me saying, you're supporting child killing. You're a child killer. And these are, if you say to them, well, we've been accused of being child killers since the nth century, they are completely blank, because to them, anti-Semitism is the shield behind which we, collectively, the Jewish people, sanitize the crimes of the state of Israel, because no one's ever taught them what anti-Semitism is. They think it's the same as Islamophobia. They think it's a form of racism, a form of prejudice, a form of being beastly to people. They have absolutely no idea about anti-Semitism. They have no idea about Jews. Even the people who are sympathetic to us have virtually no idea about Jews. They hardly ever meet a Jew. In a population of 68 million, I forget, it's going up very fast, there are 280,000 identifying Jews. Now, there are many more who are of Jewish heritage, but who have nothing to do with Judaism, and they are prominent in public life, and they have no problem, mainly because many of them are leading the charge against Israel. But they have no problem. But 280,000, it's like nothing. And so you have this very beleaguered community in which it's very hard to find any platforms in public life which defend the Jews properly. You have people bleating from time to time about anti-Semitism, but the same people will be perpetrating the same lies about Israelis killing children, which mean that anyone who is Jewish or supports Israel is guilty by association with people who are killing children. And I think it's a very, very difficult situation. And also, nobody ever can talk about the fact that a lot of this anti-Semitism is coming from the Muslim community in Britain, which is disproportionately involved. Okay, there are a lot of non-Muslims who are involved in this, true, but disproportionately, because Muslims are still a very small minority, although growing, the disproportionate number of Muslims who hate Israel and hate Jews is very large, and they are disproportionately involved in attacks on Jews. Nobody speaks about this. The Jewish community leadership in Britain, silent. Jewish community leadership in Britain,
they're too afraid to be called Islamophobes.
They're on their knees.
We know how this criticism is always silenced, and taking the example of Netanyahu's speech, we should call barbarians, and we should call barbaric attitudes toward Judaism barbaric. As you know, Andrew McCarthy, who was once a prosecutor in New York, and had a lot to do with suppressing terrorism, said Islamophobia is not a phobia. It is a term invented by the Muslim Brotherhood in order to silence criticism of Sharia supremacy. That's what it is. It's a shield for violence. Mlani, where can one read you? Tell our audiences, please, if they want to follow you.
Okay, so I have a website on a platform called Substack, and the address of the website is Mlani Phillips, 2 L's in Phillips, mlaniphillips.substack.com. That's where you will read everything that I write and all my broadcasting, my videos and so on, everything except the column that I write in the Times of London, which is behind a paywall. But everything else goes on to my website.
Mlani Phillips, The Builder's Stone, your new book. Good luck with it, and thank you very much for this enlightening conversation.
Thank you very much, Gadi. I'm always tremendously enlightened by any encounter with you.
I hope that we'll have more on this very podcast. Thank you very much.